9. Shooting on the pier. 32-year-old Kate Steinle and her family were walking along San Francisco's famous Pier 14 in July of 2015 when a single bullet pierced her back without warning. She was rushed to the hospital but died from her injuries 2 hours later. Police caught up with the shooter, Jose Inez Garcia Zarate, shortly after the incident, and divers recovered the weapon from the bay. It had recently been stolen from park ranger John Wojciechowski's personal vehicle while he was out at dinner. Garcia Zarate claimed that he'd found the gun wrapped in cloth just moments before it fired, and that he accidentally discharged it when he picked it up. In a jailhouse interview with local station KGO-TV, he also said that he took some sleeping pills that he found in a dumpster shortly before he began wandering the pier that fateful day. The case sparked widespread controversy, especially when word of the suspect's extensive criminal record began to circulate. Garcia Zarate already had 7 felony convictions under his belt before the shooting and had been deported from the US a handful of times. He faced numerous charges in connection with Kate Steinle's death, including first-degree murder, drug possession, and being a felon in possession of a weapon. However, he adamantly maintained his innocence and insisted that the shooting was accidental. Members of the public were already angry that an illegal immigrant with an extensive rap sheet even had the opportunity to shoot someone on US soil, but people were even more infuriated when Garcia Zarate was acquitted of Kate's murder. He still faces federal charges in connection with the shooting, but has been deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial. The future of the case remains uncertain, as the court waits to see if he can be restored to competency. 8. Murdered in Memphis. In early September of 2022, a young mother and kindergarten teacher named Eliza Fletcher was kidnapped during her morning jog in Memphis, Tennessee. Her body was found several days later inside an abandoned building. While police have released limited details about how Miss Fletcher died, it was clear that she was murdered. Officials later charged 38-year-old Cleotha Abston Henderson in connection with her death. Shelby County District Attorney Steve Mulroy said that authorities believe the attack on Fletcher was random and that she and Henderson didn't know each other personally. The murder left female joggers across the country feeling concerned for their safety, but it struck a particularly personal note with 22-year-old Alicia Franklin, who told the press that Henderson had attacked her a year earlier. Franklin accused local authorities of failing to take her case seriously and filed a lawsuit against the city of Memphis in relation to the allegations. Henderson was charged with kidnapping and assaulting Franklin shortly after she reported the attack, but Franklin feels that the police gave little priority to her complaint. She's also accused the Memphis Police Department of failing to thoroughly investigate her case and coming up short of their due diligence. Her lawsuit contends that if detectives had done more to get to the bottom of her report against Henderson, Eliza Fletcher's murder could have been prevented. Miss Franklin's lawsuit makes a lot of good points, especially concerning how law enforcement rushed to perform DNA tests after discovering the body of Fletcher, who was the granddaughter of a local billionaire. It didn't take them long to identify Henderson as their prime suspect, yet Franklin's case against him had been basically buried for an entire year by then. Whether or not justice will be served in either of the women's cases remains to be seen. 7. Cody Ackland. 18-year-old Bobbi-Anne McLeod experienced a real-life nightmare one evening in 2021 when a complete stranger snatched her from a bus station in Plymouth, England. She'd just left her house and was on her way to meet her boyfriend, who began to worry when the young woman never arrived at the bus station near his home as planned. Bobbi-Anne's headphones, cell phone, and bus ticket were found at the bus station she vanished from, prompting a major search throughout her community. 3 days later, a 24-year-old indie guitarist named Cody Ackland entered a local police station and confessed to abducting and killing Bobbi-Anne. He led detectives to a beach 9 miles from where she was taken and showed them where he dumped her brutally beaten remains. Ackland pleaded guilty to murder and received a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years and 190 days. At his sentencing, Judge Robert Linford described how Ackland inflicted multiple injuries to Bobbi-Anne's face and head before discarding the body. Prosecutor Richard Posner said that Ackland has a morbid interest in serial killers and that he was driven by his desire to imitate his idols. In Posner's words, his fantasy was about to become a tragic and wicked reality for Bobbi-Anne. 6. Terrorized tourist. 32-year-old Spencer Goggin was waiting for a taxi after a night out in Perth, Australia in June of 2022 when a group of strangers approached him from behind and began beating him. He didn't get a chance to see his attackers before they stomped on his head, leaving him with 2 swollen black eyes and multiple cuts and bruises. Goggin told 9 News that he felt lucky to be alive, but that nobody should feel lucky for surviving a night out. He was visiting Perth from Sydney to celebrate a friend's birthday when the unprovoked assault occurred. He later said that he could hear some women urging the attackers to get off him and to stop hurting him. The fitness coach credited his survival with the split-second decision to put his hand beneath his face, which provided some cushioning between his head and the pavement. Once the attack was over, he caught a taxi to a local hospital where he received treatment for a severe concussion. Goggin came forward with photos of his injuries in hopes that a witness would identify the men responsible for the brutal beating. He also made a public plea for people to stop committing senseless acts of violence like the one he endured, as well as other recent attacks in the area that had made news headlines. Unfortunately, it appears as though Goggin's attacker is still at large. 5. Violence in Vancouver. Residents of Vancouver, British Columbia were terrorized one evening in late summer of 2022 when a young man embarked on a series of unprovoked attacks against random locals. He attacked 3 people in public one night in the city's Fairview neighborhood, including a 70-year-old man who was approached from behind, tackled to the ground, and brutally beaten. Less than an hour later, a 33-year-old woman was punched in the face while walking her dog. The third attack happened 90 minutes after that, when a 23-year-old woman was stabbed and suffered a serious but non-life-threatening injury. Police connected the attacks to 21-year-old Martin Lamb, who they also said committed an early morning home break-in and attacked a 54-year-old woman, leaving her with serious injuries. Local Sergeant Steve Addison told CBC News that the attack was rather brutal and violent, and that it will leave lasting emotional scars, even if it doesn't leave lasting physical scars. Lamb faces numerous charges in connection with the attacks, including assault, aggravated assault, and breaking and entering. At a press conference, a police spokesperson mentioned how random attacks are becoming an increasingly problematic public safety issue in Vancouver. He went on to say that a lot of the assaults are committed by repeat offenders and perpetrators with mental health issues. 4. Abel Bahani. Before moving to Waltham Forest, England as a refugee, Abel Mary Bahani endured unspeakable suffering as a young child. He was in his early 20s when he allegedly tried to reenact the torture he'd endured by inflicting it upon someone else. In a gruesome, unprovoked attack that was captured on camera, the troubled man assaulted and killed fellow casino-goer Abraham Hale in 2020. He stomped on the victim's head dozens of times and smashed his face repeatedly with a fire extinguisher over a 16-minute period, stopping to smoke a cigarette halfway through. During the brutal beating, the casino manager ushered 7 customers out of the building and locked the door behind him for their safety. By the time a small group of police officers busted their way in, Hale was already dead. Bahani's mental state was a major focal point of his trial for the man's murder. His lawyers were quick to point out his multiple diagnoses, including paranoid schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), and psychosis, none of which he was receiving treatment for at the time of the attack. The court initially found that Bahani did not qualify for a defense based on diminished mental capacity. However, his lawyers managed to secure a second psychiatric examination, which reversed the original findings and gave Bahani the opportunity to plead guilty to the lesser offense of manslaughter. Judge Martin Picton accepted the plea and sentenced Bahani to life in prison with a minimum of 18 years. During the hearing, Judge Picton described Bahani as a significant risk for reoffending and said that the man may never be considered rehabilitated enough to regain his freedom. 3. Machete assault. 82-year-old Hubert Mullins was minding his own business as he went about his day in Manhattan one afternoon in 2022 when a woman suddenly approached him and slashed him in the head with a machete. He had no time to react or defend himself and was left bleeding on the sidewalk as he awaited medical attention. Police charged 20-year-old Deesh Calhoun in connection with the random attack on Mullins, who who works as a doorman on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Speaking with the New York Post from his hospital bed, he said that he thinks Calhoun needs psychiatric treatment and to be examined by a doctor. And he's not the first person to suggest this. Just weeks before Calhoun allegedly sliced into the elderly man's skull, she was charged with at least 7 misdemeanors in 2 separate incidents involving deadly weapons, including threats to hurt someone with her machete. She was released without bail in both instances. Fed-up New Yorkers have called on Governor Kathy Hochul to unbury her head from the sand and to crack down on violent crime and the aggressive actions of untreated mentally ill individuals. Many blame the state's easy-on-crime bail reform policies for the concerning uptick in violence that has plagued the Big Apple in recent years. Calhoun was finally jailed after attacking Mullins. She's being held on $500,000 bail while her case plays out in court. While many believe that she shouldn't have been free to continue her alleged campaign of violence after the first few incidents, it came as welcome news to learn that she's been taken off the streets, at least for now. 2. Perth home invasion. A homeowner in Perth, Australia, was left with horrifying injuries after a random stranger broke into her home one morning in June of 2022. The victim, a woman in her 30s who chose to remain anonymous for her safety, told police that a man she didn't recognize entered her house and brutally beat her. She sustained multiple facial fractures and bruises, and her eyes were swollen shut. Police Constable Alistair MacDonald told the press that the intruder managed to bust his way in through a locked door in what appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. When the victim confronted the man, he viciously assaulted her. Shocking home surveillance footage shows the woman running from the house with her hand to her face and stumbling down the street in a desperate search for help. She later told news outlet West Australian that the burglar had punched her in the face so many times she had trouble even standing up. However, she somehow gathered enough strength to flee out the front door in a last-ditch attempt to get to safety. The thief made off with several of her valuables, including jewelry. Constable MacDonald described the attack as random and one of the scariest things you can experience. He went on to say that the victim was treated for her physical injuries and released from the hospital, but that she was left feeling traumatized over the horror she just experienced. With help from the public, police identified a 27-year-old suspect who reportedly put up a violent fight and assaulted an officer when he was taken into custody. 1. Brain bleed. As unprovoked and random attacks in New York City hit their highest numbers in years in 2022, high school senior Ethan Maddie experienced the violence firsthand. The 18-year-old was sitting on a stoop outside his high school in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood in September 2022 when a stranger approached him with a brick in hand and knocked him out cold. Speaking with the New York Post after the attack, Maddie said that he didn't remember anything that happened between then and when he woke up in the hospital. In the young man's own words, he said that he'd been in fights before, but he didn't see the assault coming. He described his attacker's approach as a cheap shot and said that the culprit got him right at a moment when he looked down to grab his lunch out of his bag. Maddie was left with several facial injuries, including a broken orbital bone, and he also suffered from brain bleeding. But luckily, he survived and is expected to make a full recovery. Police released surveillance footage of the disturbing incident in hopes that someone would come forward and identify the attacker. Describing his New York Post interview, Maddie described the recent surge in violence throughout the Big Apple as really wild. He also said that he thinks society needs to seek out those in need of mental help, rather than expect those who need mental help to seek it out on their own. If you came face to face with a home intruder, would you willingly hand over your valuables, or would you fight back and refuse to let them get away with their crime? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.